Yeah, my name is Kate Wiley. It's my absolute pleasure to be facilitating this webinar this evening. First, I would like to acknowledge country. So the nation we call Australia is stolen land. First Nations people have never ceded their sovereignty of their land, and respect is owed to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island nations and First Nations people. Today I'm on Kaurna land, and hello to a group in Ghana is Namani. So Namani to you all, and I do hope you're well. I would also like to acknowledge that the First Nations value of connection to country and stewardship is one that if we all held, we wouldn't be quite in the problem we are globally now. And I think that's quite pertinent tonight when we're going to be talking about biodiversity. I'm very excited to be joined by Dr. Ken Winkle, or Associate Professor Ken Winkle, who's going to join us here tonight. Hi, Ken, how are you?
Good, thank you, Kate.
Thank you so much for being here. Before I introduce you properly, I just want to do some housekeeping. So if you're not talking, can you please put yourself on mute? This improves the quality of the sound and it prevents buffering. This session is being recorded and will be posted on YouTube. So just so you're aware of that. You can see that we've got the chat down there. If people want to communicate with each other and talk in the chat, I think that's a good thing. And at the end, we'll have a question and answer session. So if you have questions as you go and you want to put them in the chat, that's a great idea. Also, if you're a GP and you want to get CPD points for tonight's activity, the link for the evaluation form is also in the chat. I'll post that again at the end. I'd appreciate if you do that, because it allows us to demonstrate the need for education on planetary health for healthcare practitioners. So now it is my pleasure to introduce Ken Winkle properly. Can I call you, do I call you Ken or Professor Ken? Or Professor?
Whatever you like, Kate.
Whatever I like, I'll call you Ken, is a professor of the School of Population and Global Health at the University of Melbourne, and is a long-time member of Doctors for the Environment and part of our Biodiversity Committee. Obviously, he's also got a big history in venomology and is a renowned author, published many papers on that subject. We're very lucky that he's now very interested in biodiversity, and I'm very happy that you've come along to be here tonight, Ken, and I'll hand it over to you. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much, Kate. And I guess my interest in biodiversity is the thread that runs through my medical career, really, whether it's studying immunology, malaria, leishmania, the Australian marsupial mole, venomous creatures, or sustainability as intimate connections all the way through, I think, where nature meets medicine and where biodiversity meets medicine. So I think that's generally one of my messages today, is that no matter where you are in the spectrum of medical practice, there are connections to biodiversity and nature. And perhaps we overlook that, but we sooner or later will realize that we cannot eat our money, and we are dependent on all the benefits provided by nature, whether that be kind of cultural, spiritual, provisioning, basic clean air, clean water, or medicines from nature. And so we could spend the whole day talking about these different domains to the connections. And we've also, of course, had a fabulous presentation, I think last year, from Timothy Williams, the original convener of the Biodiversity Special Interest Group of DEA, who presented perhaps more on the mental health benefits from nature, and that whole movement around getting patients actively into nature for their mental health and their physical health, and building that connection of concern for country that is profoundly central to Indigenous peoples. So without further ado, I certainly wanted to acknowledge that I'm coming to you from the lands of the Wurundjeri people here, of the Kulin Nation, and that comes from Wurundjeri, from the relationship between those first peoples of this region of Victoria and the Managum and the Jerry, the gum moth that is really important historically anyway for as a food source in this area. And really, we really need to remind ourselves of the profound truth in the concept of caring for country, because the caring for the land is caring for ourselves. This is a bond that we should be making explicit. So I acknowledge traditional custodians and really look forward to strengthening our professional custodianship of country. And do take a look at this recording from Colin Hunter from the Yarra River there, which really gets to the heart of what this acknowledgement of country and welcome to country really means. It is taking on a custodianship role when we enter into these lands where we live, work, and play. So by contrast, of course, welcome to the Europeans' out of balance relationship to country, the Anthropocene, where we are undermining our own life support system on this pale blue dot. So today I'd like to talk about the nature of biodiversity. Why should doctors be involved? Why particularly now? It's particularly apposite in December 2022 to be talking about this subject, and we'll run through a couple of those historical threads and just kind of reinforce what you've already heard from Dimity with some new connections perhaps, and then talk a little bit more about what we can do about this. And then I'm sure we'll have some time for discussion. So you've probably seen this meme where we've been so preoccupied spending money, resources, effort, changing the way we do things in society around the pandemic, COVID-19 pandemic, aware that there's kind of a potential 2023 recession globally. A lot of talk, of course, after COP27, what is happening with climate change. We changed our federal government. We've got new hope. There will be positive change. We've got sustainability for the whole health system, because we are responsible for 7% of the carbon emissions of this country at the very least. But behind all that, there is a profound challenge around biodiversity, which is the foundation of the ecosystem that we inhabit. So what is biodiversity? Often, people use as shorthand is a number of species, isn't it? Which is unfortunately oversimplifying it, because biodiversity under the Convention for Biological Diversity, and you can go and have a look at the international glossary associated with the convention here, it is far more than that. The variability amongst living organisms from all sources, so land, sea, and also the ecosystems they're part of. So it considers genetic diversity, phenotypic diversity, phylogenetic diversity, functional diversity, abundance in space and time within and between species. So the bold count of dead species, if you like, extinct species, thylacine, used as a simple accounting measure, isn't it, to remind us about this, is so impoverished, actually, when we think about the real depth of diversity within and between species, communities of species, and ecosystems. And when we lose those communities, we lose that richness. And we ourselves, when we've increasingly been studying the human microbiome, we're increasingly appreciating that our guts basically have been the victim of the kind of colonialization. That is to say that if we look at traditional peoples, they have far more biodiversity in their gut, and fascinating work in paleontology is looking backwards into deep time, is saying, well, we have lost vast diversity within our microbiome compared to those who lived in times past. So each and every one of us is affected very directly by this loss of diversity and the functional attributes that it brings, including in our own gut and skin, etc., microbiomes. So I myself, University of Queensland medical graduate, my first year, my first big holiday after first semester, I went up to Heron Island, which houses uniquely University of Queensland research station. And there I met a parasitologist from the university. He was studying pathogens from nature, the transmission from the birds. And if you've been to Heron Island, you know there's thousands, if not tens of thousands of birds, noddy terns and others, mutton birds on that island. So he was interested in the passage potentially of pathogens from nature to the humans there. And I was interested in doing some research. So he said, come back, I've got a project for you. So he said, It's not studying pathogens from nature, it's studying this little furry creature here, which I'd never heard of, the Australian marsupial mole, which probably most Australians don't even know we have a marsupial mole. Quite rare, relatively little known about it, but he had been looking at parasites in their guts. He said, nobody's looked in their guts for diet. You can answer a basic question, learn about research. So little did I know, that was my first research project, my first publication in the Department of Parasitology, University of Queensland as a medical student. Little did I know that species was formally scientifically described by surgeon, first director of the South Australian Museum, Edward Sterling, strong advocate for girls being allowed to enrol in medical school. And he was a Cambridge medical graduate, but born in Australia. And he was one who formally named it. But of course, as you can see from the photo, this, as everything, is a story of epistemic injustice, because there it is. Even today, if you want to catch a marsupial mole, you will need the skill, knowledge, acumen, the learning on country that has come from the Indigenous people of Central and West Australia, South Australia. So those specimens came to Sterling and others like Baldwin Spencer, University of Melbourne, and others, physician naturalists who have studied, came to them via Indigenous Australians. So, and then subsequently I spent time working in parasitology, because in third year I heard our lectures from Paul Prosiv, and he was telling me stories of medicine and nature, which I really got excited by. So that started my story. Little did I know, but that is a story nested within so many other stories of medicine and the study of nature. We go back thousands of years, basically to the time of Galen and before. We know that doctors had to know their botany because that was a source of medicines. And they, over the last several millennia, have been studying nature, because physician itself is a Greek word coming from nature, the study of nature. Intimately was medicine ever linked to the study of botany, but also zoology. Vesalius, Harvey, leading through to Erasmus Darwin, onto John Hunter, founder of modern surgery. All of these were involved in studying comparative anatomy, comparative dissections, developing theories based on basically zoology, but also the foundations of botany, completely medical. And of course, no less than Charles Darwin, whose grandfather developed one of the first theories of evolution, worked very closely with doctors and was trained at the University of Edinburgh Medical School in taxidermy. He felt that no pursuit was more becoming of a physician than the study of natural history. But that was just reflecting the reality of medicine and medical practice. So where are we today? Why do we want to pay attention, particularly now? Well, the references are down there, but basically the state of terrestrial and oceanic ecosystems and the species within them is looking pretty poor. We've lost topsoil, we've lost primary forests, wetlands, we've lost coral reefs, ocean species, freshwater species, terrestrial species, insects, mammals, plants. 60% population decline across vertebrate species since 1970. 40% of insect species have declined in recent decades. 83% decline across the freshwater species since 1970. 50% today of the world's coral reef systems have been destroyed. And we are undergoing right now unprecedented bleaching in a La Nina period of the Great Barrier Reef, particularly the northern part of the Great Barrier Reef. So alert, the planet has a fever, the planet is being degraded rapidly. In the Australian context, the State of the Environment report recently came out after some delay from the previous government. Basically, as with the international reports, we have got a deterioration with species extinctions, deteriorating ecosystem conditions. This is reducing our so-called environmental capital, which of course is the basis of current and future economies. And this is going the wrong way. So social, environmental, and economic impacts are not only already present, they will be escalating and compounding. So there is still time to do something, and our current government is finally taking action. It appears to be going in the right direction, but we've yet to see the legislation. If you want to dive into this State of the Environment report, which has a very strong Indigenous authorship in a certain section of it for the first time. Please follow the link. And of course, as I said, there are compounding effects. So the great fires from a couple of years ago have pushed species and ecosystems further closer to extinction, and carbon emissions. So the whole effort of the DEA around reducing carbon emissions has a link profoundly to ecosystem health and species health. And going the wrong way with more carbon emissions, more energy in the atmosphere, more fires, more extreme floods, this will mean that we have more days of higher flammability, and that means more threats to already marginal populations. And this just comes from, this is a shout out to my biodiversity special interest group colleagues. I think we're just about, if we haven't already just submitted this paper, reflecting on the State of the Environment report to the Medical Journal of Australia, because Australia is not just one of many, it is one of the leading sites of biodiversity decline throughout the planet. We are in fact one of a small number, 17 of mega diverse countries, so that have really high endemicity of species diversity, and yet our custodianship, very poor. So this report looks at 5 years, goes through a whole series of ecosystems and species counts, and sets out the shocking state that 19% of our ecosystems on the state of collapse, and there is an escalating risk for further species loss due to climate change, land clearing, pollution, continual resource extraction, invasive species. And actually rather understated is the fact that the single biggest group of species that is threatened are plant species. We don't think about that so much, but it is profoundly important for the state of the environment. And of course, this is a resource, a provisioning resource, a source of medicine and knowledge that we are losing. And unfortunately, Australia is the home to the first fish species extinction in recent times. That was declared in March 2020. The smooth handfish declared extinct on the International Union for the Conservation of Nature's Red List. And of course, interestingly, that was first described by a French physician naturalist, collected just near Hobart back around 1798, 1800. So this is a little fish that doesn't move around very much, so-called relatively sessile fish, first marine fish to be declared extinct in modern times. So we have, under the Albanese government, a new opportunity, and they've made some new announcements. Minister Plevisek just recently has been committing to a new environmental protection agency, a comprehensive response to the really scathing Samuel review of the Environmental Protection and Biodiversity Act, and new national standards. The precise details we are awaiting. It's looking good, but we have some concerns until it's all in paper and it's passed as legislation. Even here in Victoria, they're talking about the cessation of native forest logging, which is a good thing for the biodiversity and the ecosystem services, but they haven't legislated it. So we need to see the details onto the past legislation. So, of course, legislation doesn't necessarily mean protection, as we've seen from New South Wales, where the koala is basically in a state of imminent extinction, despite the protected status under the EPBC Act. So this is a critical time now. And of course, the whole pandemic is a consequence of our impact on nature, particularly our threats to ecosystems. And here is a recent important paper from Nature, I think last month, which was looking, in fact, at the Hendra virus story, quantitating 25 years of land use data, bat behavior, and spillover of Hendra virus, basically concluding that land use change, climate change, has led to persistent bat residency in agricultural areas, where periodic food shortages have driven clusters of spillover infection into the community that interacts with horses. Pulses of winter flowering trees in remnant forests appear to prevent spillover. So there it is. We are starving populations, and we have a solution right in front of us. So their model is extremely effective at predicting spillover events. More broadly, this paper came out of University of Queensland in Lancet Planetary Health earlier this year, talking about the bigger picture, drivers of zoonotic disease emergence from all of our activities of intensified livestock production, climate change, increasing wildlife trade, and land use, such that we promote livestock over wildlife, we promote density, and we clear the land, and we force animals out of their natural habitat into closer proximity to our domesticated animals and also humans. So these drivers are complicated and interacting, but basically the message is we are causing this jump of infections, particularly viral infections, across, and we need to be continually aware that this will only worsen as we degrade ecosystems, as we involve ourselves in unsustainable agricultural practice from an ecological point of view, and wildlife trade persists. So there's been international responses. So this is one of those international responses, Nature for Health, Pandemics Together, that explicitly recognizes all of these links and tries to put money towards better connecting health with environment. And of course, there's the new idea of a Centre for Disease Control in Australia. You may have been involved in a submission, as my school was, into the federal government on perhaps the approach that should be taken by the new Centres for Disease Control. And one of those just recently published in the Medical Journal Australia from my veterinary colleagues who I teach with, Sandra and Siobhan, Vision for the One Health System. So I'm involved in One Health teaching. This is a way to operationalise connecting nature, wildlife, domestic animals, human health, and the environment to bring in society, experts in a collaborative way, a transdisciplinary, holistic way to try to solve these problems and to do good by the ecosystem as well as these populations of humans and animals. So we could talk more about that, but there's been a recent revision of what One Health is all about, trying to integrate a number of concepts based on critique, but it's far from perfect, but it is one way that people may be able to approach this issue. And of course, when we think about action on climate change, we think about action on carbon emissions, making the health system, making the business community, the government report on and be responsible for their emissions, but largely ignored. This report just came out this week that we are not thinking about biodiversity. We are not thinking about other risks to nature. And here is an Australian Conservation Foundation report on banks and super funds basically just failing to talk about their impact on nature beyond ball carbon emissions. And certainly the health system is not even thinking about it. So none of the big four banks have a no deforestation target. And yet the United Nations says that companies cannot be on the path to sustainability if they are funding deforestation. So think about, as Mike Forrester talked about, your shadow self, your investments, where they're going, are they undermining biodiversity? And right now, literally this week, we have tomorrow, Minister Plibersek landing in Montreal for the other COP, the Conference of Parties 15 on biodiversity. The International Convention on Biodiversity is nutting out a new framework. This has been kind of going, stuttering back and forth for some years. This was supposed to be figured out in China, but pandemic kiboshed that. So they are working on the new framework for the global biodiversity commitments. So we hope this will mean strong commitments to actually centering biodiversity, and that is connecting that custodianship of biodiversity with meeting the needs of people. So historically, there hasn't been that connection of the people with the conservation in a way that has really made a difference. Unfortunately, we've just consecutively failed over the last decade in the targets from previous such biodiversity commitments. So at least Minister Plibersek is going to Montreal, even if it's for the last few days, to hopefully take her ministry into a serious agreement to centralise this failure of Australia. And of course, we are 50 years into a whole series of important anniversaries. The Limits to Growth, a seminal book, was published 1972. The United Nations Environment Programme was basically established out of the Stockholm Conference in June 1972. So these then led to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the Rio Convention. Earlier to that, as a kind of adjunct, was the Brundtland Commission. So Gro Harlem Brundtland, a major figure there in connecting the historical events of 1972 to the present day. And unfortunately, this year we lost Moss Cass, a major champion for the environment. Some say an accidental minister for the environment, but he was certainly a progressive minister. He was a doctor who had many achievements, but one of the most salient ones is he was famous for this quote, which he made to the Paris meeting of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, I think in '74. We rich nations, for that is what we are, have an obligation not only to poor nations, but to all the grandchildren of the world, rich and poor. We have not inherited this earth from our parents to do with it what we will. We have borrowed it from our children, and we must be careful to use it in their interests as well as our own. And anyone who fails to recognize the basic validity of this proposition is either ignorant or evil. So this doctor in the Whitlam government, elected this month, 50 years ago, and in this month he was sworn in as the first Australian Minister for the Environment and Conservation. It was in this cauldron of global concern around the environment, the Stockholm meeting earlier that year, that he took action to swiftly develop the Environmental Protection Impact of Proposals Act, which has basically led to environmental assessments for all major developments since. Now, unfortunately, it did not have strong teeth, if you like, to actually mean that the minister had to particularly pay attention to the environmental impact statements. But he got that through, which did not exist in the past. And that, in one way or another, he also led to a number of investigations, parliamentary inquiries that ultimately led to Fraser government saving Fraser Island from sand mining, and ultimately also helped to sequester uranium mining in Australia. He also, very importantly, while he failed to get the Whitlam government to intervene to save Lake Pedder, that was being flooded by the Tasmanian government for hydroelectricity, he introduced legislation in '75 to create the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority, which ultimately led to the protection of the Great Barrier Reef. He also had the Whitlam government sign up to the World Heritage Convention and the Ramsar Convention. So instruments that we just think of as everyday bread and butter part of the government. Moss Cass, doctor, parliamentarian, made a difference. So my point in mentioning this is not just he died this year after a very long and productive life, but he made a difference for the environment in ways which are transgenerational, internationally significant. And of course, in that very same year, the world's first Green Party was created in Tasmania, and Bob Brown, of course, contributed to environmental consciousness, but that green movement spread around the world from 1972. That year, of course, I mentioned the first United Nations Conference on the Human Environment, connecting humans with the environment, led to the Environment Program, which ultimately led to the creation of the IPCC, and of course the various conferences that have followed on, as well as the International Convention on Biodiversity. A critical part of that, another doctor, Norwegian physician and politician, some of you may remember, Gro Harlem Brundtland. She's still alive and well. She headed up the World Commission on the Environment and Development from '83, developed the concept of sustainable future, and that led to the Earth Summit, and ultimately the tools of the Sustainable Development Goals, hitherto a Millennium Assessment. And of course, if we look at that, the connections of biodiversity and health, when you just look under the surface, it's pretty obvious, the connections. In fact, it's been reconstituted. So the models of the Sustainable Development Goals this is the way of representing that to underlie the fact that we depend for those goals largely on the biosphere. So the environment is the ultimate determinant of health. Society and economy are subsidiaries of that. So the representation of the environmental determinants of health are there in the Sustainable Development Goals, which echo back to 1972. We are using this, which is from Scotland, I believe, representation of the connections between biodiversity and health by way of the benefits from nature concept, benefits from the sea. This is another refashioning of the ecosystem services idea. It's not without its critics, but basically there we are. We get provisioning, materials, foods, medicines, clean air, clean water, cultural services, instauration, restoration, kind of mental health, well-being benefits. We get supporting services from healthy soils, photosynthesis, which of course we depend on every day, every moment of every day for the oxygen in our lungs from the deep ocean plankton and the forests of the world. So we're not going to recapitulate that. We could spend the evening going through those. But here's a really interesting example that you may not have considered, connecting biodiversity and health, particularly invertebrates. Little creatures we don't think about. We talk about marsupials. We talk about charismatic creatures like even the sharks. There's a lot of concern recently about the sharks and rays. Great decline globally in their biodiversity. Big effort to try and do something about that in the last couple of months. International agreement has been struck. But when we think about little creatures, the invertebrates, and you may be aware of the massive decline in the bogong moth. So here is a way of representing the Sustainable Development Goals and the different ways of viewing nature. What we should be thinking about is insects as allies, insects as solutions, rather than wholly, let's find the Mortine and destroy those insects. Let's pack onto our crops all of these pesticides, because when you think of all of the Sustainable Development Goals, whether you're talking about hunger, whether you're talking about economic growth, ecosystem services represented in life on land, life below water, insects are there as solutions for all of those. I'm looking forward to the day when I can have insect powder pancakes. I've had scorpions and I've had crickets in Mexico, and they're just fine and crunchy. So I think that we need to be thinking about the creatures large and small in new ways, because like it or not, we are dependent upon them. Historically, though, when we think about biodiversity and health, particularly in the 20th century, it's been thinking about pathogens from nature, whether it's Ebola, SARS, influenza, coronavirus. And certainly there is that, but that is just largely a consequence of this spillover where we are pushing the pathogens into our spaces. And that is a way we need to reframe our approach. I talked about One Health as one way to think about reframing, where animals and humans are part of the story. The environment historically has been relatively lacking there, but part of the movements I've been telling you about recently that redefined exactly what One Health is, trying to do a better job of that. And of course, my background in venoms is an exemplar of the threat from nature, certainly, but also the potential benefits from nature with respect to medicines. And of course, the very most obvious example of this is angiotensin converting enzyme inhibitors, a class of drugs that came from an observation of physicians about the effects of the Brazilian pit viper on blood pressure. But there are many other examples that we could talk about, whether it is, here we go. Well, here's the Nobel Prizes 2015, artemisinin and ivermectin. Important drugs for different pathogens come from the study of bacteria in soils and of traditional Chinese medicine. So these benefits of nature are widespread. And I was just going to talk about every one of these groups of species has new drugs in development or drugs historically. So for example, cone snails, zinconitide, the analgesic. We have from the Gila monster anti-diabetic medication. From sea anemones, a new drug for multiple sclerosis. Anti-tumor medication coming up from scorpion venom. Snake venom, ACE inhibitors, just one example. Brown snake venom, very powerful prothrombin activators. So we've got potential for new clotting agents there. And spiders, really neglected along with the scorpions, but have been in recent times the source of really novel compounds that may be new drugs for Parkinson's, for stroke and neurological diseases, amongst other things. So what can we do about this? One model is nearly the Bob Brown model. Put your money where your mouth is, start buying up pockets of biodiversity. He put the environmental prize that he won some decades ago towards the creation of the Australian Bush Heritage Fund. That's one model. I know many of my colleagues actually have property they're trying to redevelop or regenerate. That's one way of doing it. Another way, every day of the week, is thinking about your body as an ecosystem. That is, we have more microbial DNA, more microbial cells in our bodies than we have human. So we have this intimate link with the non-human every day of the week. And so one of the things you need to be thinking about is eating biodiversity to encourage your inner ecosystem, and to select things that are biodiverse and come from, wherever possible, regenerative rather than destructive forms of agriculture. And there's some fascinating work coming out that we could talk about that really says what you eat is profoundly important for immune system and for not just mental health and well-being through really interesting effects of fiber on our brains and our immune system, but in many other ways, things like asthma seem to be intimately linked to how we treat our inner ecosystem. Dimity talked about mental health and well-being, particularly the role for children being in nature early on, to not just acculturate them to the values of nature, but also to the value for their bodies and their minds and their senses in growth and development in terms of early exposure to nature. Last Child in the Woods, another really interesting reference to a whole movement throughout the world around this. In terms of most of us living in cities, we don't have a block of land to regenerate, but we can start advocating for and getting involved in things like Cities for Biodiversity that recognizes where we work and live every day can be the source of novel interventions to strengthen biodiversity, to strengthen the ecosystem services provided by particularly trees, and this is one of the recent meeting reports that you can look up there that talks about integrating urban greening and ecology into neighbourhoods, thinking about biophilic cities. Related policy brief from the United Nations Environmental Commission is the Sustainable Urban and Peri-Urban Forestry Movement, which talks about the 3-30-300 rule. I'm involved in work with the colleagues in ecosystem and forestry science at the university, which is trying to apply that rule to healthcare settings. Can your patients see a 30% tree cover from their patient bed? Can they get into, or staff, 30% tree cover area within 300 meters? Is there within 300 to 900 meters high quality public green space? There are a whole lot of benefits that we could talk about there, from the thermal buffering effects, the promotion of urban cooling, food production, lots of novel things happening with pollinators and urban food production, green economies, disaster risk reduction, fascinating stuff happening, all kinds of possibilities. Get involved. Here's an example of another one in the cities, thinking about ways that we can enhance natural assets, bringing in the idea of urban trees, naturalized stormwater ponds, rain gardens to help our ecosystem services help us. In a healthcare setting, explicitly, there's new thinking. This is from Singapore that has been pioneering the incorporation of green into campuses, healthcare campuses. Out of the United States of America, this report from Pennsylvania in the Lancet talking about incorporating gardens for local production, particularly of herbs and greens for patients and for staff, nature prescriptions, kind of what Dimity was talking about, and ways that we can think about reducing the stress in hospital for patients and staff from engagement in the fascination, the mindfulness in green spaces, let alone horticultural therapy for spinal rehabilitation and others. So thanks for thinking about this subject. Hopefully we've got some time for some discussion. I'll just finish on reflecting, as I like to do, on history, that Carl Linnaeus, the famous Swedish physician naturalist, said so long ago, and he was fascinated by economics, nature's economy shall be the base for our own, for it is immutable. Well, we're proving that it's not quite immutable, but ours is secondary. An economist, therefore, without a knowledge of nature is like a physicist without knowledge of mathematics. So perhaps now we should be saying a physician without knowledge of nature is therefore like a physicist without knowledge of mathematics, because we are part of biodiversity. We are not apart from biodiversity. Thank you very much.
Oh, Ken, thank you. Thank you. That was absolutely fabulous. What a rich talk you've just given us, Ken. That was amazing. There's so much information that you gave us then, and it's incredible that we are so largely ignorant of so much of what you said. And as you presented, it's so, it's foundational to everything that we do. And yet we just kind of ignore it all the time and just blithely walk on by. And, that really hit home with so much of what you say. I'm sure everybody who's been watching and listening to you have been as equally as impressed as I have been, and have, quite blown away by all the things that you've shared with us. I'm just wondering if anybody has any questions. Please feel free to come off mute and show us your faces, and, let's have a bit of a chat if people want to. Or I've got a couple of questions I'm happy to ask you, Ken, if that's okay.
Yeah, I just put in a little tidbit. We could talk about this, but I've recently found out, some of my veterinary medical colleagues would know all about it, but the whole, I think it was called the single biggest wave of extinctions in recent times was the loss of amphibians associated with the chytrid fungus. And that seems to have been associated with the medical profession exporting the giant clawed frog from Africa for the use in pregnancy tests, because those frogs have brought around the world the chytrid fungus. So medicine is not without fault explicitly in extinctions.
That's a bit upsetting, isn't it? It's a rather sobering thing.
Yeah, I think for those of you who knew the late Rick Spear, the veterinary qualified as well as medically qualified academic from James Cook University, he was instrumental in making that discovery. So 3 years for the veterinary doctors.
Wow. I know that you were asking us in the talk to think past viral spillover, and that often in biodiversity we kind of go there first. So I am, if you excuse me, Ken, I am going to go there first, because I think that the viral spillover concept with COVID is such a missed opportunity for us to be talking about nature. It's like if we could have been talking about that for this past 2-3 years, and elevating the necessity of looking after nature for us to be healthy. I just feel like we missed an opportunity, a golden moment there.
Well, I suppose one of the challenges we have is the acculturation of the pathogens from nature. In part, we have got people like Michael Crichton as part of that, whose Andromeda strain echoes in some of the concern, skepticism from some doctors about the origins, for example, of the COVID-19 virus. So he fictionalized drama where doctors were not always the good guys. And so it is a great source of dramatic appeal to have as Richard Preston did with his level 4 work on describing the filoviruses, Ebola, and others. It's incredibly dramatic to talk about the virus that is causing blood oozing from every pore, and doctors racing to save us from the pathogens from nature. And of course, we do have politicians that take that up, those tropes, such as I am from Queensland, so I recognise Bob Catter as one of those people who said some years ago, we should be killing all the flying foxes, which is absolutely the worst thing.
Well, or we should chop down all the trees so we don't have fires, and all of that.
So to be fair, there are those, particularly in the veterinary community, who have been proposing through One Health the whole idea that we are undermining our own capacity to fight pandemics if we continue to ignore the mechanism of that spillover. So absolutely, we need to try to tell that story in a more effective way.
Don't we? Don't we?
Yeah.
And maybe we need to. Maybe that's a challenge for us in DEA to find a nice, simple way of saying those words, because the challenge is that it's complicated, and so how do you say it in simple hand bites? There is a question in the chat from Arabella Daniel. Arabella, I don't know if you want to come off and ask the question yourself, or I'm happy to read it out for you.
Yes, sure. Sure, Kate. Thank you.
Thank you.
I was interested, Ken, in how much air pollution comes into consideration in your advocacy for biodiversity, because my exploration of air pollution is that there's no cell or organ in the human body that's not impacted by air pollution, and certainly no part of our ecosystem that isn't impacted. Yeah, I'd like to hear your thoughts on
Well,
that.
I'm no expert on that, but I do know that studies are increasingly saying if you've got air pollution, then you've got more likely to be more severely affected by COVID-19, and that the virus, the particulates of air pollution, particularly when you're thinking about forest fires and burning of wood and other organic products, seems to be a vehicle for pathogens to spread. So literally a fomite, if you like. Plus, of course, in many parts of the world, no electricity, they require access to nature for their source of fuel. And so the drivers through poverty then push them into the forest, and they necessarily will get their fuel from their local environment. And doing that, if it is done in a way that is out of balance, will accelerate local deforestation and accelerate access of those people to pathogens. So there's kind of a complex story there that I'm sure others can tell better. And of course, someone has pointed out there, Marion, that trees are a source of filtering for our air. And I know that in some parts of the world, in North America, scientists have been looking at things like mosses, aerial mosses, as a repository for checking the local pollution. So they look for heavy metals in the moss, in the trees in Northwest Pacific. So it is a sentinel. That is another way, as Marion points out, that the greater the green space, the more likely you have clean air, the more likely you will have better health outcomes for your lungs and therefore generally. So that's just a few comments.
So gardening's a revolutionary act sometimes, isn't it? Like, actually, gardening is a good idea. Like, it's a healthy thing. I really loved how you, focused a lot on solutions at the end there, Ken. And so, that sometimes we can feel so overwhelmed by the enormity of these problems that we get, stymied into inaction. You just think, well, it's all too much.
Well, that is, to me, one of the most exciting things, that we're in a time now, although crisis from various fronts, of transformation, of different groups coming together, whether it's under Planetary Health, One Health, Eco Health, or other ways of putting it, to say, hey, actually, tree canopy in urban Melbourne really is important for our health and well-being. That tree then is also a source of hundreds of species potentially per single tree, and so that we can craft a narrative that is really positive. And of course, who doesn't want to work? I would certainly want to work in the 60 Leicester Street building that houses the Doctors for the Environment. What a beautiful space where you have the trickling of the water, the natural air conditioning constructed in a biophilic manner, the natural light, or the wood. So it is something that increasingly I think we will try to harness creatively, the therapeutic powers in the built environment. And I'd like to see a lot more doctors talking about that in the setting of new hospitals, bringing in biophilic values. I know don't have to convince people like Forbes, but the system has got a lot of inertia. So we build these concrete monoliths that propagate pathogens actually, as opposed to thinking about how do we work with nature in a way that says biodiversity is a buffer against pestilence is a buffer against pandemics, is a buffer against the, it's a building resilience into the ecosystem. And we are in ecosystems every day of the week, even though we don't think about hospital healthcare settings as ecosystems.
Yeah, we separate ourselves too much, don't we? Yeah, we culturally see ourselves as other, outside of nature, rather than absolutely embedded and, you know, part of nature. I see Forbes has come off. Forbes, do you have a question or comment that you'd like to share, or not really?
Oh, it's one of the few males. It's one of the few males here. I was just enjoying the commentary. Not many men, lots of women running the show, which is good. I mean, it is an interesting one. I had no idea in the DA in general what proportion of DEA members are female. I suspect it's a vast majority, but so I'm not trying to take the limelight.
Oh, okay. No, sorry, Forbes. I don't mean to put you on the spot at all either.
No,
I should give a shout out.
A friend of mine.
Our past chair of Biodiversity Special Interest Group, Dimity, GP, female, and our current chair, Brooke, a rural GP from Northern Territory, or she's in Northern Territory, JCU graduate, also female. And most, of course, of our team there is female. So really strong caring for country ethos there, I think, which is not unrelated to the acculturation in gender.
Well, yeah, toxic masculinity and destroying nature, there might be some kind of corollary there. But I also see Michelle Smith has her hand up. Michelle, would you like to come off mute and ask your question or contribute, please?
Yes, thanks very much, Kate. So the world population was recently announced to be 8 billion people, and people are forecasting that we'll have 10 billion by 2050. I wonder, with land degradation and continuing climate-related disasters, whether this is going to impact the food supply and lead to famine. And I'm just wondering if there's any healthy and peaceful way to reduce the size of the human population.
Okay, complex subject, but suffice it to say that, interestingly, when I was going back looking at 1972, that limits to growth, and I'm not saying they were wrong in their basic concept that we were pushing the ecological boundaries and this will rebound on us eventually, but they predicted by 2020 civilization would have collapsed. So it is true that we have wrung a lot of energy, food to sustain a much larger than expected population of the planet, but that we know that's not sustainable. But we do know we are incredibly wasteful. Humans are incredibly wasteful, and we could be doing things that are incredibly different but still highly nutritious to feed the population. And I guess I'm always very aware that is the top 1% that are the consumers of most of the world's resources, and that includes us when we look at our medical incomes of whatever kind compared to most of the planet. So, and of course, we know education, literacy changes fertility rates. So I'm less worried about that than our incredibly wasteful way of interacting with nature rather than the sheer numbers, because it is consumption of the affluent that drives most of these things rather than the poor. And we know that we can do things radically differently. Insects, as a source of protein and fat, are basically almost carbon neutral. So I think there's a lack of imagination in reconstructing the economy to address health and well-being for all.
We've really got to get into the crickets, don't we?
Well, that's just one example. The truth is, when you eat something made of flour, you wouldn't know whether it was derived from a cricket, an earthworm. Sorry, not earthworm. You know, the other worms that they use. Someone will know as a source of protein powder and for things like pancakes. We would not know, truly. When I ate in China scorpions, it was just like some kind of crunchy fried carb. And eating crickets in Mexico, exactly the same thing. Not, to me, not noticeable. And of course, when you go back in time and different cultures, these taboos we've got about eating these different types of foods are very culturally ingrained. So we can reimagine the way we use the resources to be much lighter on the earth. That I think that's part of the excitement of where we're at. And of course, this is true for everything like packaging and the whole movement to grow new types of biomaterials that are completely ecologically regenerative, sustainable, things like the mycelium for packaging. You can make leather out of the mycelium in a way that is incredible these days. So mealworms, that's it, Amanda, thank you.
surgical gloves out of some kind of plant-based polymer. Wouldn't that be great? You know, like as far as waste and all of that is concerned.
Sure.
You know, and I just really want to reiterate the point that you make about, you know, the population of the planet is a very concerning thing. But when we do think that the top 10% of the population are responsible for more than 50% of the emissions, and that includes all of us on this call, then it gives us an opportunity to do something about it. It says what I do is powerful and that I can make a difference myself, which personally I find very helpful and lets me sleep a little bit at night. But
and
also
we have to consider
really,
our kind of positionality in this.
That, and that
here in Australia, in medical system, in medical schools, we are the beneficiaries of all kinds of privilege that your average Earth citizen is not.
So it's incumbent upon us to do something, but it also means what we do is effective.
Yeah.
And, you know, that helps a lot, doesn't it? And that if we, you know, together we can do things. And of course, the other thing for population is the education of women and girls.
Absolutely.
And emancipation. So, you know.
But the other point to make is that we are in a deteriorating ecological literacy. So my father passed away a couple of years ago, but he was incredibly expert at picking bird calls. So I could just kind of ask, what bird is that? He'd say, oh, yes, black-faced cuckoo shrike.
Yeah.
And he had this knowledge of being a child in the bush and acculturating bird sounds, amongst other things, in a way that many of our parents and previous generations were. And of course, if we think about the loss of Indigenous languages in Australia, we are losing volumes of ecological knowledge there in a way that is priceless. So I would exhort us to try to strengthen the engagement of the young people in ecological literacy, if you like. And perhaps my work with the marsupial mole was kind of some little attempt to do a little bit of that. Yeah.
It sounds like it started you off at a very beautiful beginning to your career, actually, Ken.
Well, I've got to say, like any research, I spent a lot of tedious hours counting ant shells and acacia seeds, but that is the stuff. And that was the first and most, I would say, objective study of the diet of the marsupial mole that we have in the literature. It's very small literature, but there it is.
We've just got to time, so I will just say thank you again so much, Ken, for such a rich lecture, and you've just found it absolutely fascinating. And if people want to do that little clap emoji on their screen, I think that's a very nice thing to do. And again, point out that I've put the link to the CPD points in the chat for any GPs who want to get their points. And so I am now going to press stop on the recording button.
One last middle message. The Biodiversity SIG and the members of it have put out put a lot of effort into a biodiversity policy, which is really rich and overlooked. So I didn't talk about it. I should have talked about it. And come and join the Biodiversity SIG. Lots going on.
Absolutely. And so if you go to the DEA website, you can find all the stuff that the biodiversity group's done, and there's some fabulous work there. I absolutely agree. All right. Thank you very much. So I will stop.